Lesson 4.5, Feature Writing, Writing Your Questions. In this lesson, we're going to go over how to craft your questions that you're going to ask your sources when you interview them. Before you sit down to write questions, it's important that, like we talked about in a previous video about finding sources, that you do your research first. The most annoying thing you can do for that person you're interviewing is ask them a question that you could have found the answer to from somebody else an easier way that you didn't really need to ask them. If it's a question that you can find the answer to without asking them, it's not a question you should ask. Now, sometimes you can take that information that you've researched and you can ask them to confirm that information. For instance, you can look up stats from the football team if you're interviewing the coach and ask him, hey, from my research, we saw that this player had this many yards the last game. Is that accurate? Is that what you guys had? And they can either confirm that that's accurate or corrected. But for the most part, if it's something you could have already found out somewhere else, don't ask it. Now, if you've done your research, then there are some questions that you should already kind of know that you want to ask based on what you've been thinking about and what you've been working on. When you set out to write your questions, there's basically two different question categories, and those are basic info questions and deeper storytelling questions. Basic info questions are generally who, what, when, where questions. And these questions tend to give you short answers, one-word answers, really just giving you basic information that you might need for the story. Again, this is where you maybe can confirm some of that information you researched. These also include questions that start with words like do, are, can, will. And the reason is because these kind of questions tend to give you one type of answer, and that is yes or no answers, or usually like a single word answer. Now, those kind of questions are important to get the info you need, but the problem with those type of questions is they don't turn into quotes that you can use for your article. You can't really write a feature article if your quotes look like this. Not long enough, not enough information, and not interesting. The other type of questions are your deeper storytelling questions. These are your questions that usually start with how and why, and they're questions that force your source to think, to connect the dots, to infer something, to deduce something, to really get inside their heads and think back. There are also questions that invite your source to tell a little story. We call little stories anecdotes. And those little stories, those little anecdotes, are what make for great quotes in your article. These are the kind of quotes that you can actually write a feature story around. They're the ones that will bring out the life and story for your audience. They're the ones that you really need to write a great story. So when you're going to do an interview, you don't necessarily need the basic info questions. You can have them, but you definitely need these kind of questions, because these are the questions that will really make your article. So when really thinking about the questions that are going to put your story together, that the source is really going to talk to you, you want to spend most of your time working on these kinds of questions and really thinking about what kind of questions can you ask them that are going to get them to tell you those little stories or give you that insight or analysis or their thinking behind something that someone wouldn't be able to get if all they knew was to ask these questions. So you can have these basic info questions. They're okay. In fact, in the next video, we'll talk about how a few of these are good to start with, but you really need to focus on these kinds of questions. And especially if your time is limited with the person you're interviewing, if you don't have a lot of time, you shouldn't waste any time on these. You should cut straight to your 2 or 3 best of these. Now, there's also a super secret question type number 3. In his book Radical Write, feature writing guru Bobby Hawthorne calls these memory questions. You only need these type of questions in certain situations. Usually you would want to use this type of question if you're writing a personality profile, so you're really getting into an article about like one person and who they are and what they're about. They're good for that. They're also good if it's really important for you to understand the motivations, the deeper motivations and fears that your source has, or what makes them tick. And if that's really important to your story, which it not always is, then this is something that you would want to explore. These memory questions are almost psychological. They're things like, what was your childhood like? What were your childhood ambitions? Who were your heroes when you were a kid? Or, what annoys you? What pleases you? What would you say are your worst weaknesses, your strengths? And these kinds of questions are the kinds of questions that help you figure out what makes your source tick. A lot of times what you learn from these type of questions in a personality profile will make for a great opening feature lead. But like I said, there's only a few situations in which you need to use these kind of questions. You're gonna want to mainly focus on those how and why storytelling questions that we talked about a little earlier. Now that you understand these types of questions and the kind of questions you need to focus on and write, you can start writing your questions and look forward to the next video when we talk about what do you actually do in an interview.